Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In this week's special report, we sat down with Professor Kerry Gershaneck, author of Media Warfare, as well as Bradley Thayer, founding member on the Committee on Present-Danger China. They touch on Beijing's influence overseas through ideological means, such as through media warfare, why Taiwan is such a target, how it relates to the U.S. and allies, and what it means going forward. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Tiffany.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Very pleased to be with you.
So recently, there's a lot of focus on Taiwan if there's going to be war between Taiwan and China. And there's concern with countries stockpiling nukes or increasing military activity. But there's another part that doesn't seem to get as much attention, which is the soft power side or media warfare, for instance. So how do you see that playing into everything?
Tiffany, the political warfare approach is really the way that the Chinese Communist Party intends to absorb Taiwan. It's the way it intends to beat the United States of America. They don't want to go to kinetic warfare. But in the minds of the Chinese Communist Party, everything is warfare. They are at war with us. It is political warfare. We'll discuss political warfare in a moment, but basically media warfare is one of the key pillars of political warfare. It's how you divide, you demoralize, you confuse another country, your adversary, to such a point that the adversary collapses, and it makes your victory so much easier.
So what is political warfare? What are the goals and strategies under it?
It goes back thousands of years, but basically one of America's most respected diplomats and strategists was a fellow named George Kennan. And George Kennan in 1948 said basically that political warfare is the use of all elements, all means at a nation's command, short of war, short of shooting, dropping bombs, shooting bullets, kinetic warfare, to achieve its national objectives. Okay, everybody buys into that. Most nations buy into that. Everybody does a little bit of political warfare. The Chinese Communist Party has taken that initial concept that Kennan so brilliantly described in 1948 pertaining to the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics that we were up against at that time. Well, this new totalitarian threat coming out of Beijing takes this basic concept that George Kennan gave us and puts it on steroids. From the CCP's perspective, political warfare is total war. It is all-encompassing. It is what they call unrestricted war. Again, understand the mindset we're dealing with. Everything is war, from the Politburo and the Standing Committee, from the very high levels in China. Everything is warfare. And so this is unrestricted warfare. This is top-down driven. It is from the CCP Central Committee, from the National People's Congress Standing Committee, the very highest levels of the party state in China. This is directed and closely coordinated. All the activities of political warfare, and especially media warfare, very closely very closely controlled, planned out and executed at lower levels, but directed very tightly from the senior-most levels of the government in the party state that is Communist China.
And so media warfare falls under political warfare. So what are the goals and objectives for media warfare then?
Well, media warfare is the employment by a state, typically, and China uses this expertly, to frame narratives, to frame perceptions about opponents or about issues in international politics. And so while all states do that to some degree, the Chinese Communist Party is expert at framing issues in ways that favor them, that emphasize the objectives that they seek to achieve, while seeking to minimize support for their opponents.
So what are some examples of how they minimize things or get their objectives?
Well, certainly it would be, we can look at, for example, U.S. domestic politics to see the way that media in China, frame issues, whether it was American debt or racial difficulties in the United States, or the Biden presidency, or the effort to impose diplomatic sanctions on the Winter Olympics in Beijing next year. All of them are framed in a way which touts what the CCP seeks to achieve, the way the Chinese Communist Party seeks to frame, or the way the Chinese regime seeks to frame issues. So this is ongoing. This is done constantly by the Chinese regime. So we could take these instances. The Olympic boycott, for example, the Chinese regime frames that really as a way of U.S. impotence, as a way of the fact that the Biden administration has not received much support for this among traditional allies. Yes, Canada, UK, and Australia have backed the United States, but of course many allies have not, whether in East Asia or South Asia or in Europe, Africa, and in South America. So that's touted as weakness for the United States. The Biden administration advanced a plea. A few states responded to it. And so the narrative then that can be created is that the United States is weak. The virus is another, the pandemic is another classic example of this, how the regime, the Chinese regime, lied about its provenance, about the origins of the pandemic, and sought to cast blame on the United States Army, for example, in the military games in Wuhan a few months before the outbreak of the pandemic, blaming the United States, the U.S. Army in particular, for the outbreak of the pandemic. That's patently false. But nonetheless, the Chinese regime advances that in a way to cover up its mistakes and its lies, its deception, its mendacity, in favor of blaming innocent parties like the United States.
So some have brought up that using media warfare or this type of unrestricted warfare are kind of the most powerful tools a country has, but it's also the hardest to spot. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think it is for two major reasons. One, because the Chinese regime is really good at doing it. And then secondly, because the United States has lowered its guard, has lowered its defenses. Principally, media warfare is about ideology. And when it comes to ideology, this is a contest the U.S. should win hands down. U.S. ideology of freedom, religious freedom, respect for minority rights, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, are far more favorable around the globe than the Chinese regime's totalitarian approach and oppression of minorities, religious minorities, suppression of human rights. So in theory, at least, the United States should win this battle hands down. But because the U.S. has dropped its guard, we have seen the Chinese regime being able to advance narratives. The idea that, for example, China is the wave of the future, and other countries should follow the political organization, economic system of the Chinese regime, in contrast to what the West created, which is freedom, liberal ideology, and the freedoms associated with that, and the freedoms and economic policies that actually have lifted many of the hundreds of millions of the Chinese people out of poverty, and really saved the Chinese regime's position as a consequence of that. So it matters greatly. And the fact that ideology is not emphasized in the United States, liberal ideology to the extent that it was, certainly during the Cold War, but in the wake of it, with the end of history moment, the fact that many in the West believe that ideological conflicts had been resolved. The West won. Everybody knew that liberal democracy and capitalism were the wave of the future, had a tendency to cause an atrophy, if you will, in our instincts. And thus, this is the situation in which we find ourselves today, where we're needing to recast and to reach down and to recognize that ideology matters, media warfare matters, as well as economic issues and trade issues and military issues, diplomatic issues, et cetera. in order to combat the Chinese regime. When the rest of the world looks at it, they're going to find, as they did in the Cold War and in its wake, that the West offers a far better future for the peoples of the world and the Chinese people themselves than the future offered by the Chinese regime.
And so, Kerry, you have a book on this topic called Media Warfare, and in it you mentioned a war without gunfire. So while Beijing conducts the media warfare against several countries, including here in the U.S., why is Taiwan such a big focus?
Okay, so what Taiwan represents is the continuation of the Chinese Civil War. The Republic of China never surrendered. The Republic of China still exists. It exists on Taiwan. And so from the CCP's perspective, Taiwan, they're, again, well beyond the scope of the show. There's the legal status of Taiwan and whether it ever did belong to China and what is its legal status today. But bottom line is Beijing says it has always belonged to China, just like Tibet has always belonged to China. Mongolia has always belonged to China. The South China Sea has always belonged to China. One day it'll be Lake Michigan has always belonged to China. But in this case, we're talking Taiwan. So they want to complete the 1949 Civil War, the end of the Civil War, and destroy the Republic of China. But more important from their perspective, to achieve Xi Jinping's great rejuvenation. You've heard that term before. The fascist, the Sino-fascist China dream, it entails the great rejuvenation of taking territories, countries, and waters that never historically belonged to China. But the fiction that is generated, the narrative is, oh, it's always been China's. So unified China, as they put it in their terms, by bringing in ending the political entity known as the Republic of China, and bringing Taiwan under control.
So what are some of the tactics to kind of achieve that?
First, the PRC is trying to fulfill certain objectives, and the tactics are tools that they use to get you to those objectives. So one of the objectives for the PRC in trying to destroy the democracy on Taiwan is to destroy the faith of the people there in the process of democracy and in democratic institutions. They want to divide the people of Taiwan and demoralize them. They want to ensure that there are nothing but economic and diplomatic problems, diplomatic isolation, failure of the economic program. So they grind down the people of Taiwan. So they just want to quit. Again, to win without kinetic warfare, to win without shooting, without fighting, without invading, you basically demoralize the people to the point that they just quit.
And so what can Taiwan, the U.S., and allies do to counter or fight that?
Well, I think three things, Tiffany, could be very useful in the employment. One would be the resurrection of U.S. ideological warfare campaigns to recognize that ideologies don't speak for themselves. Facts don't speak for themselves. It's very important that the U.S., the Biden administration, and its allies recognize what is, to many and around the world, obvious, which is the West offers a superior form of government than the Chinese regime. But that has to be explained. Why does it? Why is freedom better than totalitarianism? Why is it that standing with Taiwan is superior, and having the Taiwan government, Republic of Chinese government in place, and viable? Why is that better than having unification under the totalitarian Chinese regime? We have to explain why that's the case to billions of people around the world. Secondly, it's very important that the Taiwanese continue doing what they're doing, which is to maintain their outreach to the rest of the world. We can see steps very importantly with Lithuania, right? The fact that the Taiwanese and the Lithuanians, and credit to both of those countries for standing up to the Chinese regime. But the Taiwanese also have to speak for themselves and continue their efforts as they are. And then thirdly, with respect to global media and U.S. allies, it's very important that international media, Epoch Times or BBC or other media, recognize the value of freedom in international politics and the necessity of standing with Taiwan. Other allies, U.S. allies, need to stand with it too. We mentioned Australia and Japan and the great work that they've been doing as well. But this also goes down to even small states' international politics, which are important. Those are indices, really, of which way the wind is blowing, if you will. So whether that's in the South Pacific, and working to ensure that South Pacific governments stand with Taiwan, or in Central America, right, where we've seen Guatemala standing with Taiwan. Unfortunately, Nicaragua has decided to move with the Chinese regime, lamentably. Well, that should be called out, right? Why is Managua doing that, right? What is it that causes Nicaragua to move in that direction? So we need to have much more active involvement from U.S. allies, whether those are states like Nicaragua or other small states, but key allies like Germany, for example, France, and the UK and Italy within Europe also have to stand with Taiwan, as some are doing, but those messages could be sent more forcefully. Ideological warfare, again, is constant. You're always having new people enter the issue, individuals who don't understand the issues, to whom it has to be explained. So we need to do a better job than we have in this respect.
My recommendation is that Taiwan build on the global leadership status it achieved early in the Wuhan flu, the COVID-19 pandemic. Taiwan was a world leader. Well, perfect. Build on that. Become a world leader in teaching other countries, democracies, which are oblivious, either willfully or just for other reasons, to the political war that's being fought against them by Beijing. Taiwan can start, a term that I worked with a couple of senior officials in Taiwan, is the Asian Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. Set up an educational institution, regional, where you can bring in representatives from countries around the region globally and have curriculum, have speakers, have the capabilities there to exchange. Here's what's happening in Lithuania right now against us. Here's what they're doing to us in the Czech Republic. Here's what they're doing to us in the Philippines. All these places are under massive attack right now, and Italy, same, from all over the world. Taiwan can provide the education center, the center of excellence for the region and globally, if they are willing to invest in that, and then be seen as a leader in it. And implicit in that is learn from the others. Taiwan, Tiffany, is what we call in America the canary in the coal mine. What China does against Taiwan that works in terms of political warfare, they're going to use against other countries. So Taiwan can share what's happened to them so other countries have advanced warning. But then Taiwan can also learn from what's happening in other countries, because some of that is novel and some of the solutions are wonderful. Taiwan has done some great things at the end of December of last year. When they passed the law and the anti-infiltration law, but there's still more to be done. Final points: raise the cost to China, raise the cost to its enablers, its collaborators in Taiwan for supporting or conducting and supporting media warfare. Expose them. We have models in the U.S. under the presidency of Ronald Reagan going back about 40 years ago, where to help defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War, we had something called an active measures working group. We also had other working groups that exposed their United Front operations. United Front isn't a CCP concept. They learned that from Lenin. They learned that from Russia. And so expose the United Front operatives in Taiwan, expose the news media that are routinely carrying the CCP's narratives that are basically Xinhua, but with Taiwanese news media names. Okay? Expose them. Then the final point I would say is education. When I talk to bright, aggressive Taiwan master's students or PhD students, and they learn what I'm talking about with political warfare, they say, I want to do my thesis on that. I want to explore that. And then they go talk to their counselors, and their counselors say, don't touch it. You'll never get it. And the same things happen in America, incidentally, all too often. Students will get back with me and say, "Oh, my counselor or this other professor said, no, you'll never get it. You'll never get a visa to China. You'll never be invited to all the name conferences, and you'll be ostracized because the China hands don't like to explore this." Tough. Somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to have the courage to stand up and really pursue this as topics of education and develop curriculums, not just in that center of excellence, Tiffany, but also within traditional academia. Within Taiwan, National Taiwan University should have entire courses on it. NCCU should have entire courses on it. Other universities should be exploring it, but there's a reluctance to develop that curriculum. For Taiwan, don't feel bad. Again, I've run into the same thing with even the armed forces of the United States, the National War College, National Defense University, and the Marine Corps University and Army War College. Oh, well, no, we don't teach about that. Okay, well, you're going to lose, because you don't even know how they're conducting war against you without lifting a rifle. And that's the way that China intends to defeat you. And you won't even study it as a formal course of curriculum. That is suicidal.
And so earlier you brought up the need to beef up the U.S. ideological warfare in response to the CCP one. So what would be some ways of implementing that into action?
Well, one way would be to have an ideological component to the National Security Council. That the United States really uses or divides ideological issues between the State Department, between commerce, between some other actors and element of the Defense Department. Unifying that would be really valuable. Let's have a consistent message that's informed by state, defense, of course, commerce, treasury, other actors, of course, American media and academics, other actors, to convey the positive message. This is what the West is. This is the value of the West. This is what the West has contributed. This is why it must be sustained. At the same time, calling attention to the evils of the Chinese regime and how that they are illegitimate, how they abuse the human rights of their population, and why they're a negative force in international politics today. All of that would be very valuable. I would add to that also, we should move ahead towards establishing a global internet so that it's accessible to all individuals within China, of course, as well as around the world, that would allow the Great Firewall of China to be defeated regularly and consistently, so that the Chinese population themselves can access the facts. Could access Epoch Times, could access other media to get truthful reporting about the nature of the Chinese regime. So there's much that could be done in terms of organizationally, allowing us to present better, a better strategy, if you will. Technology needs to be improved for defeating the Great Firewall. But we should also recognize, lastly, our strengths, and that is that this should be low-hanging fruit for the West. And that is, if you want to compare the ideology and the political systems of the Chinese regime versus the West should win hands down. Around the world, whether we're in Africa or whether we're in South America, South Asia, Europe, around the world, the U.S. treats its partners, its allies, as partners and as actors who are to be supported and who are to be dealt with honestly. The Chinese regime treats people as tools to be exploited. And we see the behavior around the world as being the exploitation of people and the environment wherever the Chinese regime shows up.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you both on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Tiffany, thank you so much for having me, and Merry Christmas to you and your family and the NTD team.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with Professor Kerry Gershaneck, author of Media Warfare, as well as Bradley Thayer, founding member on the Committee on Present Endangered China. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.